Shabbat Shalom. I hope you all are well. I am blessed and I'm back again with a video. In today's video, I would like to take a look at what the constellation Pisces means in this Hebrew month, Aviv. Now, before we get started, I want to go ahead and make a bit of a foundation for us to go on. Mazareth means constellation signs. And Yahuwah placed these constellations in the heavens for a few different reasons, with one being to tell the story of the birth of our Messiah as well as his second coming. Each constellation represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. There's 12 constellations and 12 tribes of Israel. And Yahuwah put each constellation in the heavens to tell the story from the beginning of the virgin birth of the Messiah to the end of his second coming and the redemption of his people, the 12 tribes of Israel. Unfortunately, the stories that Yahuwah put into the constellations have been twisted by Babylonian astrologers and expanded by Greeks into fantastic myths. Also, many people have been taught to use the constellations for their zodiac signs. This is not about our astrological signs of personality traits or qualities, or even our love life. This is Yahuwah's divine hand and his voice in the stars. What's interesting to me is that at this current time we are in our Hebrew New Year, and the Most High has begun to fight for his people. At this current time and Hebrew month Aviv, there is also a story being told in the sky, as Pisces is the constellation that correlates with this month. According to the constellation Pisces and Yahuwah's story being told in the stars, the two fish here are not seen free and drinking in fullness, but are bound and held securely back by a strong band or cord. This cord is tied around the tails of both fish and is fastened in the middle of the neck of Cetus, the monster of the sea. The symbolism here is all connected with the sea, in which the fish are restrained from freedom and blessings by being tied to the monster. In Scripture, the heathen nations are sometimes symbolized by the sea. This can be found in Daniel chapter 7 verse 2 and Revelations chapter 13 verse 1. Revelations chapter 13 verse 1 reads, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy." Yahuwah's chosen people are seen as fish in the sea of nations, taken away from the place of promise and blessings and scattered among the nations without national identity themselves. If we take a look at Amos chapter 4 and verse 2, we see where Amos told Israel that this would happen. He says, "Yahuwah, our Elohim, had sworn by his holiness that, lo, the day shall come upon you that he will take you away with hooks and your posterity with fish hooks." Meaning, because of the sin of Israel, Yahuwah would curse the Israelites and their future generations. Following the dispersion of Israel, they would be under the influence of evil for hundreds of years, and among the nations of this world. This was foreseen in the Pisces constellation, where the fish were bound to the evil monster of the sea. But we know that this story being told in the constellations ends with the triumph of the Messiah coming a second time to redeem his people. Yahuwah's promises are for sure, and his purposes for Israel are certainly to be fulfilled. In Jeremiah 16 and 16 it says, "Behold, I will send for many fishers, said Yahuwah, and they shall fish them. And after will I send many hunters, and they shall hunt them, from every mountain, and from every hill, and from out of the holes of the rocks." But long before the prophets lived, Yahuwah placed the story in the skies, and the sign Pisces foretold the scattering of Yahuwah's chosen people among the nations. The sign of Pisces is also connected with the coming of the Messiah and the regathering of Israel. So even though the fish are bound right now, the promise in the stars tell us that there's going to be a second coming of our Messiah to regather his people from the four corners of the earth. Now, if you're still with me, I'm about to show you a short video clip. This man is talking about how the stars and the constellations, how they correlate with the birth of the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, and how Pisces right now is talking about the redemption and the coming of our Messiah to break the bands of the sea monster. So I'll kind of give you a heads up about something. When he's talking, you need to apply what he's saying to the true Hebrew Israelites, the so-called black people, because when he speaks, he's talking about the whole world or either the Jewish people. So just know that what he says really doesn't apply to the world or the Jewish people, but instead it applies to the children of Israel. Not the fake Jews, but the so-called African Americans, Negroes, black people who are scattered to the four corners of the earth.
The next sign is the sign of Pisces. And in the Dendera zodiac, it's called Pico Orion, or Pisces Hori, which means the fishes of him who cometh. In the Hebrew, it is named Dagim, the fishes. This represents the people of Elohim, the Almighty. These are the people of him who cometh. Now, I'll be getting into these a little bit later. I'll be showing how these represent the tribes of Israel, the two houses. This one represents the 10 northern tribes, or Ephraim, and this one represents Judah and Benjamin, the two other tribes. I will show you how I come to that in a little bit. But the main theme of this is the blessings of the redeemed and the bands. They are bound to see this. They are bound by bands, but they are bound to see this, who is the beast from the sea. Whenever certain celestial events, as we get into this later, occur, that represent whenever Israel is going into bondage or coming out of bondage, like the Exodus or they were going into the captivities, there were celestial signs occurring in this constellation. And I'll be getting into that later, because it's talking about their captivity or release from captivity. And you see over here the Lamb, his arm is coming out to break the band, to break their captivity. The band is Arisha. This means the redeemed bound, but binding their enemy. They are bound, but the enemy is going to be bound. Now, the Dagim, the fishes, is closely connected with multitudes. In Genesis 48:16, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons and says, let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. The margin in the King James Version says, in the Hebrew, is as fishes do increase. So it's talking about the multitudes as fishes do increase. It's a figure that is used. The band, it means Israel is now bound. The great enemy still oppresses, but deliverance is sure. Aries the ram is seen with his paws on this band, as though about to loosen the bands and set the captives free, and to fast bind their great oppressor. This is all Bowenger's book, The Witness of the Stars, 1893. Now, the Christians use the sign of the fish in the early days. They use the sign of the fish, or they use the sign of the anchor. You don't find the cross used at all in the first 300 years. In the catacombs, when the Christians were buried and stuff, they always had the signs of anchors, which means the anchor of their soul. And they also use the sign of the fish. You never see a cross for some reason, because, well, the cross at that time, many people were wearing a cross to Mithra. And the Christians did not want to in any way be associated with Mithra. I'm not saying the cross is a bad thing to wear, but they didn't want to be associated with the Mithra worshipers. And so their signs that they wore were anchors, which represents the Messiah is the anchor of our soul, and the fish. And from the Witness of the Stars on page 96, 97, it says, indeed, this sign of Pisces has always been interpreted of Israel. So it's always been interpreted of Israel. Both Jews and Gentiles have agreed on this. Aberbanel, a Jewish commentator writing on Daniel, affirms that the sign Pisces always refers to the people of Israel. He gives 5 reasons for this belief, and so affirms that a conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn always betokens a crisis in Israel. That's not necessarily true. We'll be getting to this a little bit later. But because such a conjunction took place in his day, 1480, he looked for the coming Messiah. Actually, this conjunction did take place 3 years before the Messiah was born. It was Saturn, and it was actually not just Saturn and Jupiter, but Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars occurred in the sign Pisces. but it doesn't necessarily have to occur in the sign Pisces. But this is what happened 3 years before the birth of Messiah, and again 3 years before the birth of Moses, the same sign occurred, but in the constellation Taurus, which we'll be getting into later. This is a Decan constellation of Pisces. This is the chained woman. This means they're redeemed in their bondage and affliction. The Hebrew name for this is Surah, the chained. You see her chained here. So she is in bondage and affliction. The star names are El-Faraz, the broken down. I don't know if I have those up here. I said El-Faraz, which means the broken down. Mirak, which means the weak. El-Amak, which means struck down. Adhil, which means the afflicted. And Mizar, which means the bound. So she's bound and afflicted. And this happened to Israel a number of times. This is what this constellation represents. It was just interesting. I took the constellation Pisces and placed it over the ancient maps of the Mideast or the Middle East area. And I just took Pisces, I did a transparency of it, put it on the map. This is the way it fell. I didn't enlarge it or anything. It's interesting. Here you have down here, you have Jerusalem and Joppa. But you see this fish here goes to the north. And this fish here goes over to the east. It was in 722 BC that the 10 northern tribes were taken into bondage up to Aprad. They went through Hamath and Aprad, then to Haran. Then they went over to Nineveh and Calah and were dispersed into these areas here. They were first taken north this way. And it was in 586 BC that the tribe of Judah and Benjamin were taken over to Babylon. This fish is laid right over top of Babylon. So you have the two captivities. You have the 10 tribes that were taken captive to the north, and you also have the tribes of 100 some odd years later, 586 BC, they were taken over towards Babylon. It's interesting how this fish falls on top of both of them. So I don't know if the prophets knew it. This fish was seen in the temple of Dendera as Pisces 2000 BC, which is a long time before any of the captivities. If the prophets knew about these things, I don't know. But it's interesting that how they do represent the captivities of Israel, and they're bound here, and they're taken into Babylon. They're taken to the north. I found that to be kind of interesting how it laid out on the map like that. That's why I say that one represents the 10 tribes, the other represents Judah. This is Ephraim and Judah. That's what they represent. In the tribal symbols, you have the 12 signs of the constellation. We come to the Temple of Solomon, you have only two animals in there. There's a lion and there's the bull. Now the lion represents Judah and the bull represents Ephraim or Joseph and Manasseh, but it represents also the 10 tribes. Now Isaiah 51:21, 52:3 is written, "Hear now this, thou afflicted, awake, 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 awake. Put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem. Shake thyself from the dust. Arise and sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion," represented by Andromeda. "For thus saith the Lord, ye have sold yourself for naught, and ye shall be redeemed without money." This is speaking about the captive daughter of Jerusalem, which is portrayed in Pisces and Andromeda. She's bound. Another Decan constellation for Pisces is Cepheus. This is the Greek name, and this is the enthroned king. He has a scepter in his hand here, and here is the bride next to him over here. The star on her shoulder, Alduramin, means coming quickly. Alfurk means the Redeemer. So this is the Redeemer. This has Messiah. Many people in their cultures say they were a Redeemer and got to the past, but there's only one Redeemer. We know that to fulfill all these things, and that's Jesus Christ, Yahshua HaMashiach, or Yeshua. Arai is who bruises or breaks. He breaks the kings of the enemy. And we're beginning into this later on. This is the North Star under his foot, and all things revolve around this star. This is where the North Star is now, so all things revolve under his feet. I'll show you this later on when we get to the second session. But this is who bruises or breaks. This is the enthroned king representing Messiah, Jesus Christ, Yahshua, when he's enthroned. Now, Cepheus means the crowned king, the Redeemer coming to rule. And then Dendera zodiac, that means Pekuhor, which this one cometh to rule. The Greek name by which he is known is Cepheus, is from the Hebrew and means the branch. Again, here we have the branch. And it's called Euripides, the king. At the same time, saith the Lord, will I be a God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. So he was the father of all of Israel. He is the king. Some of the promises here. I'm looking forward to these promises coming to pass fully. We have a lot now, but we got a lot more coming.